In our last session, of course, we discussed household goods. Before I leave that subject, I wanted to cover one other element with you. Let's assume that you have some items of personal property in your house, and they don't belong to you. Let's say that you borrowed something from a relative. You borrowed a television from your parents or the next door neighbor. Those don't get listed in your schedule of household goods. Within your bankruptcy petition, there's a section called Statement of Financial Affairs. One of the questions that you're asked in that section is, do you have any property in your possession that belongs to somebody else? And that's where you'll fill in that, well, yeah, I've got a television, borrowed it from my mother. So if you've got any personal property in your possession, it's going to be listed in your bankruptcy somewhere, and you're going to disclose whether you or someone else own it. So I just wanted to cover that with you so that you don't get confused. Let's take the motor vehicle exemption. First of all, the only way to have ownership of a motor vehicle in Missouri is to have the title in your name. So each debtor gets a $3,000 vehicle exemption. So if you pull out the title and it's titled to you and your wife, then each of you get a $3,000 exemption. Unfortunately, if you're married and the title is only in your name, then you're going to be limited to that $3,000 exemption. You can't claim an exemption for property that you don't own, and your wife can't do likewise. So hopefully the title will be in both names. Now, as I've pointed out in other parts of this series on exemptions, you can't add your wife to the title and then file bankruptcy. Those four unities, time, title, interest, and possession, that rule stops you from being able to do that. Now, so one, you want to make sure that the exemption is claimed on behalf of you or your spouse, whoever has title to the vehicle. Now, the exemption is limited to one vehicle per person. So let's assume your husband and wife and you're filing. Well, you can claim an exemption for $3,000 on one of the cars. She can claim an exemption for $3,000 on the second car. Or you can both use a $6,000 exemption for one car. However, one thing you can't do is you cannot claim the exemption for three vehicles. Let's assume you own a car, your wife owns a car, and then you have a motorcycle. Well, that motorcycle is not going to be protected within this exemption because you're limited again to one vehicle per debtor. So you need to watch that. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to lose the motorcycle, because you may be able to use the head of household exemption or the wild card exemption and protect all or part of that motorcycle. Remember, the exemption you're claiming is protecting your equity in the vehicles. It isn't what the vehicle's worth, it's what your equity is. So the fair market value of the vehicle minus what you owe, that's what needs to be protected by the exemption. Let's take the next exemption that comes up, and that's jewelry. You know, these exemption laws were passed in the Missouri legislature, so it's obvious that the jewelers here in the state used their influence to get a very generous jewelry exemption. They want you buying their jewelry. So a wedding ring is exempted up to $1,500. Each debtor gets that exemption. So if you and your wife own a wedding ring, you've got a $3,000 total exemption you can claim. Just because your wife wears it doesn't mean that you don't both own it. Now, when you're listing your jewelry other than wedding rings, each debtor gets a $500 exemption, and that's fairly generous too. When you're listing the property that you own, the jewelry, here's what I would suggest. I would put down man's ring, $25. Man's wedding band, $50. For the women debtors, you don't need to separately list one pair of gold earrings and one cosmetic case, I would just put down miscellaneous costume jewelry and give one amount, and give it a fair amount, because you've got a very generous exemption. If you each own watches, put the watches down for what their fair market value is. Watches have really declined in value, as we all know, so it shouldn't. This exemption should be more than generous to meet most people's needs. We've hit the wild card exemption. We've hit the head of household. Tools of the trade. Each debtor gets a $3,000 exemption for the equipment or books or tools that they use in their business. Now, if only one of the debtors is in business, there can only be one $3,000 exemption. You have to have both spouses in the business and owning those assets if you're going to try and use a $6,000 tool of the trade exemption. Those are three exemptions that are very valuable within your bankruptcy petition.